Hello, you're listening to Storytelling Saga, the podcast that shares stories. I'm your host, Allie, and this week I'm discussing the do's and don'ts of dialogue. And I actually did talk about dialogue when I shared writing tips way back in episode 7 of this podcast, but now I figured to really dive in deeper, talk about what dialogue is and what it isn't, and what you should do when writing dialogue versus what you should avoid when writing dialogue. And most of these tips are from a book I read a few years ago titled How to Write Dazzling Dialogue, The Fastest Way to Improve Any Manuscript by James Scott Bell. And really, the most important thing to remember about dialogue is that it is not meant to be everyday speech, but rather it is stylized speech. In other words, dialogue that we ourselves every day in natural conversation have, such as, hey, good morning, how are you? Or, hey, how's your day going? Things are just mundane little conversational pieces that don't necessarily add to the plot of the story. So it's important to be mindful of that because then that can actually weigh down the plot when it's not serving the story in some way. And really, he describes that there are 5 key functions to any form of dialogue. And these functions are reveal story information, reveal character, set the tone, set the scene, and reveal theme. So if your dialogue isn't doing one of those 5 things, it's just going to be unnecessary and something that you can ultimately cut from your script or your novel. And another great quote I had found years ago, actually, is from an author and screenwriter named William Monahan, who says, "Dialogue is used to reveal not what we want to say, but what we are trying to hide." And that's an interesting way to think about dialogue. And really the whole purpose, especially when 2 characters are conversing with one another, is that it's important to keep in mind the characters' motivations and their agenda and what they want out of the conversation. And the way you create conflict is by having 2 characters want different things from that conversation. So that adds to the tension, that makes the plot interesting, and that moves the story forward. And also, these are 5 tips from a different article I found. This is by author Rick Riordan. So these are his 5 tips on dialogue. Number 1, no 2 characters should sound the same. Everyone should have their own unique voice. So that's important to distinguish people's personalities, especially when you have people with opposing views. Thus, again, adding to the ultimate conflict of the story. Number 2, he says, avoid authorial intrusion. Let your character speak and avoid descriptors or padding when possible. So another thing to remember about dialogue is that it's essentially an action in the story. In other words, it's used for the character to ultimately get what they want. So it's all part of their motivation and their ultimate goals in the story. So if they're there just making small talk, there has to be a reason for that small talk. Maybe perhaps they are trying to kill time, or they're trying to distract the character of some sort, or they are trying to be casual, trying to hide something. Whenever a character speaks, there always has to be that motivation there. Number 3, he says, compress dialogue. It often sounds more realistic when the dialogue is compressed or abridged. Choose only critical parts of the sentence and eliminate the rest. So a big don't in dialogue is to not ramble with your characters unless there is a purpose for that rambling. So if there's characters having these big speeches, these long paragraphs back and forth, that's first off not realistic, and secondly, it's important also to be wary of what's called sometimes talking heads, when characters are just talking back and forth and not necessarily doing anything, especially when you're writing a screenplay. But that goes the same for a novel as well. If you just have long paragraphs back and forth of just dialogue, it's important to focus in on what's the true intent of what the character is saying in the speech and really focus on that. So to eliminate anything that is extraneous And then also be mindful of, well, what are the characters doing in this scene? Are they just sitting down? Maybe they're having coffee, so things like that. Maybe here and there, especially if you're writing a novel then, say if the character maybe is nervous, maybe touching their face. So also thinking about actions you can put in rather than constant speech. Maybe they look away, maybe they are mumbling, maybe they are screaming. And that is also actually another thing in dialogue, especially when you're writing a novel, is to be mindful of when you use dialogue tags. And primarily, you should only be using said, because if a character is screaming something or murmuring something, it should be conveyed in the speech itself, rather than saying so in the dialogue tags. Like, I'm so angry, he screamed. Instead of doing that, just, I'm so angry, exclamation point, and that comes across. And also, really, I just use that as an example, really you shouldn't be saying that you're angry, but rather showing it. That classic show, don't tell rule in fiction and in writing in general. So show how they're angry by maybe they stomp their foot or they rise in their chair, or they're visibly shaking in anger or getting frustrated. Just how you show it, making fists versus just saying it. But really, so back to the dialogue tags though, the reason for that is because it can weigh down the narrative, that it shouldn't be the main focus. And yes, here and there you can do, like, say, if the character whispers it, you can say they whispered, or if they ask, obviously, like if it's a question, the person asked. But for the most part, just saying said, and also not being over-reliant of saying it, but to clarify who's speaking, but then not go back and forth, especially when it's just two characters talking, but always being clear, but then not every single line with those dialogue tags. And another thing, too, I learned is that being mindful of when characters use each other's names, especially when it's two people in a scene. So this goes for, again, with a novel, but also when writing a script, if it's, say, a husband and wife talking, that you don't often use someone's name all the time when you're addressing them, when you're just, like, say, sitting at the table with them and talking, because it's just you two at the table, like the both of you. So it's not necessary. So basically just always being mindful of those unnecessary extra words. Even words also such as, well, like, because again, going back to that ultimate rule I said at the beginning, that dialogue isn't meant to be natural speech. It is meant to be stylized speech. So not everyday conversation. So yes, that is natural when we pause and be like, and like, I say like so often, my God, but there are other ways to convey the character's nervousness or uncertainty or things like that. Number 4, he says, show only the dialogue that needs to be shown. Zoom to the part of the conversation you want the audience to hear. Don't repeat information the audience already knows. Fast forward to the interesting part. So that's an important thing, and obviously exposition is a tricky thing to balance, especially when writing a pilot, because you have to introduce the characters and introduce the world and their relationships, etc. So it's a matter of how do you establish their relationship without being overtly expositional, because people don't every day say things like, oh, hey, how are you, my sister? Like, just stupid things like that. Or, oh, yes, how is your husband of 3 years? You don't overtly say the information, especially when it's things the characters already know. So it's a matter of how you convey that, because the whole thing is also in novels too, that you're always wanting to leave the audience guessing to some degree, and if the audience is ahead of the information, in other words, if the audience, there is that whole thing with dramatic irony, of course, when the audience knows something that a certain character doesn't, but if two characters are talking about something that they both already know, then that's just not going to feel realistic. And it's not going to have the drama and the interesting things that we love about shows, movies, books, or even with comedies as well, obviously. But in particular, when it comes to that, the important thing is just to be mindful of those things. And also especially like, oh, so as you know, like even just cutting out those kinds of phrases as well. And number 5, he says, use dialogue to display conflict, not impart information to the readers. The speakers should have opposing agendas. They do not want the same thing out of the conversation. Their words should reveal their character, not just backstory. So revealing character, of course, that also means if you have a teenager character, they're going to speak differently compared to a character who is older, or characters who come from different backgrounds, so maybe characters with distinct dialects. So going back to that How to Write Dazzling Dialogue book by James Scott Bell, he says, dialogue should be crisp and tense to encourage the audience to keep reading or watching. And the speech that comes out of your characters' mouths must always have a purpose. So again, he highlights the importance of your characters having their own agendas, and that you should be mindful of it in every scene, that if they don't have an agenda in that scene, then there's no reason for that character to be there. And of course, sometimes when you have characters, they don't have to talk in the scene, but there always has to be a reason why they're in that scene. Maybe they want to listen, maybe they're eavesdropping. So really, another tip for writing dialogue is to read it out loud after you write it. And that goes for if you're writing a novel, a script, anything. See if it sounds natural, not forced, not having the characters just feeding information, making sure it has that conflict in there. Because again, opposing agendas for each of those characters is key. So going back to exposition, James Scott Bell says there are two ways to deliver this information, through narrative and through dialogue. So that's in a novel, obviously, but then in a show or a movie, it's through action. So then he says, when including exposition in dialogue, the reader must never catch you simply feeding them information. The first thing to look out for is a character saying anything that both characters already know. Determine how much exposition you need at the front of your novel. Act first, explain later. Readers love to be left wondering. By holding back the motivation and waiting to reveal it, it creates mystery. Once you know what you need to reveal, put it into a tense dialogue exchange. In other words, hide the exposition within confrontation. And then going back to avoiding that everyday type of dialogue, he says, the dullest exchanges are those between two people on the same wavelength with nothing gripping to talk about. Watch out for those sitting down for coffee scenes. If you have two friends or allies sitting down to talk, don't make it just about feeding the reader information. Make some trouble. Here's how. So then here is his advice. Number one is to remember those agendas. Add objectives in conflict to create more interest and keep the reader engaged. Figure out each character's desire in each scene and shape them so they face some form of opposition from the other characters. Next, he says, get into more arguments. If the agendas create sparks that lead to flames, so much the better. Arguments can run the gamut from mild to outright screaming matches. That gives you a wide berth and a simple rule for scenes that seem to drag. Just get the characters into an argument. Even a playful argument will work. Next, he says, set up barriers. Another way to add tension is to erect a barrier to communication. These can be outer or inner barriers, i.e., if two people are discussing a deep, dark secret that must be dealt with immediately, the intrusion of another character at just the wrong moment adds another barrier. Dialogue tension can also be increased by interior barriers. Most often, this is because one character has an emotional reason for not talking or avoiding a subject. Usually this is something the other character is unaware of. To make a scene stronger, find a way to bump up the conflict. Add an annoying quirk or interruptions or a more scathing remark. Get the fire going, then stroke the flames. Dialogue full of conflict and tension is also the fastest way to improve your scenes. So another thing, too, that I had learned is that when a character asks a question, or if they're asking a series of questions, then that's something that they want from the other character. In other words, they want to get information from the other character. So sometimes it's a good idea to not have the character answer right away if you want to add tension to the scene as he discusses, to add conflict to a scene. Because basically the whole thing is creating obstacles to make it more difficult for characters to get what they want. And then when they eventually do get what they want, it's all the more satisfying because they worked harder to get it. Another tip is the fear factor. Agendas, arguments, barriers, and fear. By keeping those 4 things in mind, your dialogue will sizzle as well as dazzle. You'll be pulling readers into the heat of every scene. This results in a page turner. And then he also talks about subtext when writing dialogue. And he says, when you write a scene, your text is above the surface of the water. That's what the reader sees. But underneath you have a huge chunk of unseen ice, the part that's a mystery. Most subtext should operate like that. In other words, what's going on in the scene is more than what is seen. You can weave subtext naturally into your dialogue scenes by knowing things the reader doesn't and/or the other character doesn't. Some of these things can be secrets, past relationships, rich backstories, shocking experiences, vivid memories, fears, hopes, yearnings, etc. So that's an interesting thing too that I've learned. And really also when you watch shows and stuff, that sometimes there's more that is said when things are unsaid. Like there's more in the silences, in the looks, than what they actually say to one another. So when things are left unspoken, sometimes that has more of an impact, and then people can draw their own conclusions, their own interpretations. And one other concept he talks about in his book that I want to touch upon is the concept of parent, adult, child. And he says, the idea in transactional analysis is that we tend to relate to each other by the roles we see ourselves in. These roles fall into one of three categories. Parent. This is the role of full authority. The parent can lay down the law and enforce it. The parent is the final word. If there's an argument, the parent pulls rank. My way or the highway was coined by a parent. 2 is adult. This is the even-minded, even-tempered role. The adult says, let's be objective about this. Balanced, rational, analytical. The sort of person you want in charge in a crisis. And 3 is child. Emotional, irrational, selfish, whiny, trusting, innocent, tantrum-throwing, pouting. If you have characters operating in different roles or in the same role with opposing agendas, the tension is automatic. The one exchange to be careful of is the adult-to-adult conversation. You will need to add some tension to that scene, usually via the fear factor and barriers. Note that during a scene, characters can change roles for strategic purposes. For instance, if an adult isn't getting his way, he can become a child for a while, or a parent. So it's interesting concepts to think about when writing dialogue and which of these 3 roles each character is serving in any given scene. And then lastly, I want to address a few other do's and don'ts of dialogue. This is from an article titled What to Do and Not to Do in Your Characters' Conversations by Jamie K. Schmidt. One don't is don't waste your reader's time with small talk. Cut to the chase, as we said. Don't have your characters speak in paragraphs. Keep it to a few sentences. Again, cutting to what's only essential. Don't drop in large chunks of backstory. Hint at it or keep it to a few words. So again, not being so overt with the exposition. Again, recapping, don't overuse throwaway words like look, okay, oh, etc. Don't tell the reader emotion in dialogue, but rather show it through action because you want to make your readers feel the emotions your characters are feeling. Do listen for cadence in the back and forth exchange. Good dialogue is very much like poetry. Not in that it's supposed to have rhyme and meter, but that there is a rhythm and structure to it. Do confirm that your character is speaking in a consistent and appropriate manner, or again, depending on their age and their background, things like that. Do make sure you layer meaning into your conversation and that the dialogue serves more than one purpose. If possible, what are they really saying to each other in the subtext? Is one character hiding something from the other? How do the other characters feel about each other? All of this should be apparent in the phrases they use as well as how the lines are delivered. Do remove unnecessary dialogue tags. Not every line of dialogue has to be attributed to someone, especially if there are only 2 people talking. Again, we've discussed that. Do make sure your characters have something unique about them so it's obvious when they are talking. Does one character speak in gruff, one-word sentences? Is another character sarcastic and never takes anything seriously? Or is the main character always upbeat? Do break up the dialogue with action. And then the last thing she says, when you're done listening to your dialogue and checking off these do's and don'ts, the final thing to do is to make sure it flows well with the rest of the narrative. Don't be afraid to cut anything that sounds awkward. It will make the scene and your writing stronger. So also too, something I had learned is that when planning your story and doing the outline, even with that, to actually avoid as much as you can, if possible, to actually avoid putting any dialogue in and really just focus on the action and what the characters want, what's going on in the scene, because it's so tempting to just jump in with dialogue, and especially if you're writing a comedy and jokes and things like that. But it's always important to remember that everything has to serve the plot and the characters in some way. So again, characters having opposing agendas, that creates the conflict, adds tension, makes for more interesting dialogue and a more interesting story. So basically, overall, less is best with dialogue. Long speeches can be condensed, and sometimes you don't need dialogue at all. It can all be just shown through action or looks or even through silence. And now when the characters do speak, it's all serving a purpose, revealing character, pushing the plot forward, setting up the conflict and the overall goal for all of the characters. And with that is going to conclude this week's episode of Storytelling Saga. You can follow the podcast on Facebook and Instagram at Storytelling Saga, as well as on Twitter at Storytell Saga. You can also send me any questions, comments, or writing prompts by leaving me a message in the contact section of storytellingsaga.com or by sending me an email at storytellingsaga@gmail.com. Next week, it's late and I can't sleep. I raise a window for some spring Palo Alto air, but it doesn't help. I'll be discussing a short story called Nirvana, written by Adam Johnson. Until then, thank you for listening, and remember, write what you love.